There is a family in fictional history that managed to do something almost no one else has ever done. They didn't just survive the end of the world, they flew away from it on the backs of dragons and then came back to conquer everything in their path. They ruled for nearly 3 centuries. They built the greatest city in the known world. They forged a sword from the flames of a dragon's breath and sat on a throne made of the melted weapons of their enemies. And then, piece by piece, they destroyed themselves from the inside out. So today, we're going back to the very beginning. Not Daenerys, not even Aegon the Conqueror. We're going back further than that, to a continent that no longer exists, to a prophecy that haunted generations, and to the choices that set everything in motion long before a single dragon ever crossed the narrow sea. Let's get into it. Part 1. Valyria, the world before the world. Before there were Targaryens on the Iron Throne, before there was even an Iron Throne, there was the Valyrian Freehold, and calling it powerful is almost an understatement. Valyria was an empire, a civilization that dominated most of the known world for centuries. Their dragon lords bonded with dragons, used them as weapons, as tools, as symbols of absolute dominance. They built roads that lasted 1,000 years. They worked stone in ways that no one has been able to replicate since. Their magic was older and stranger than anything the rest of the world had seen. And at the center of it all was a peninsula on the eastern continent, filled with volcanoes. The 14 Flames, they were called. The Valyrians had learned how to harness the heat and power of those volcanoes. It was the source of their strength, and it was also, eventually, the source of their end. Because roughly 400 years before the events of Game of Thrones, every single volcano on the Valyrian Peninsula erupted at once. The ground cracked open, the sea flooded in, fire and ash swallowed everything in a single day. One day. The greatest civilization the world had ever seen was gone. They call it the Doom of Valyria, and to this day, no one in the story fully understands what caused it. Some people believe it was a magical catastrophe. Some believe it was deliberate. Some believe it was both. What we do know is that almost no one survived. Every dragon lord house, every dragon, every ancient seat of power, gone. Almost no one. Part 2. The Dragon Lords Who Left Early. 12 years before the Doom, a young Valyrian nobleman named Aegon Targaryen did something that, at the time, probably looked insane. He packed up his entire household, took his family, took their 5 dragons, and sailed west to a small, cold, strategically unimportant island off the coast of Westeros. The island was called Dragonstone. It was windy and gray, and not particularly pleasant, and basically everyone in Valyria would have thought Aegon had lost his mind. His daughter, Daenerys, was the reason he did it. Daenerys Targaryen, known as Daenerys the Dreamer, had a prophetic dream. She saw the doom coming before it happened. She saw the volcanoes, the fire, the end, and Aegon believed her. He moved the family. He left behind status, power, and the greatest empire in the world on the word of his teenage daughter's nightmares. And, 12 years later, every other Dragonlord family burned. Think about what that means for how the Targaryens understood themselves afterward. They were the survivors. They were chosen. Daenerys had seen the future, and that gift, or something like it, would echo through their bloodline for centuries. They became a family that believed in prophecy the way other families believed in gods. It shaped everything they did, and it made them more dangerous and more fragile than anyone around them could have guessed. They stayed on Dragonstone for about 100 years after the Doom. They kept their dragons. They watched the world outside reorganize itself without Valyria to rule it. The 7 kingdoms of Westeros were exactly that, 7 separate kingdoms, often at war with each other. each with their own kings and their own ambitions and no particular reason to cooperate. And then a man named Aegon Targaryen decided it was time. Part 3. The Conquest. Aegon the First, Aegon the Conqueror, landed on Westeros in approximately 2 BC, before the conquest, in the timeline the show uses. He was accompanied by his 2 sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, both of whom were also his wives. The Targaryens practiced polygamy in their early generations, justified partly by tradition and partly by the need to keep the bloodline and the dragon bonding ability as concentrated as possible. He brought 3 dragons, Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar. Balerion was not just large, Balerion was incomprehensibly large. His skull, mounted in the Red Keep, was described as big enough for a man to stand inside his open jaws. His fire was black, and his wingspan could blot out the sun over a city. He was ancient even when Aegon rode him, born in Valyria before the Doom, and he would not die until nearly 2 centuries after the conquest, when Aegon sent envoys to the kings of Westeros demanding submission. 5 kingdoms bent the knee. 2 did not. House Gardner of the Reach and House Lannister of Casterly Rock, 2 of the most powerful houses on the continent, formed an alliance and marched on Aegon with a combined army of around 55,000 men. Aegon met them on an open field with all 3 dragons. What happened next is called the Field of Fire, and it's exactly what the name suggests. The Targaryens did not win a battle that day, they ended one. Around 4,000 men burned to death. Another 10,000 were wounded. The Gardeners, the entire ruling family, were killed outright. Their house ended there in the fire. The Lannisters, seeing the end of the Gardeners, chose to surrender. The only king who successfully resisted Aegon was Torrhen Stark of the North, and even he didn't do it with armies. He rode south with his host, got to the Trident, looked across the river at Aegon's dragons, and knelt. He bent the knee without a single battle being fought and became known forever as the king who knelt. His people would call him a coward for generations. Historians in the story would call him one of the smarter men to ever rule the North because he kept his people alive. Dorne was the one exception to the conquest. Queen Maria Martell and her successors refused to submit, and the Targaryens could not hold Dorne even with dragons. The Dornish didn't fight them in open battles. They melted into the mountains. They used guerrilla tactics, and most devastatingly, they killed Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes using a scorpion bolt through the dragon's eye. What happened to Rhaenys afterward is not confirmed in detail, but she was held captive in Dorne for years, and what was done to her during that time is one of the darkest moments in Targaryen history. Dorne would remain independent for another 150 years, eventually joining the realm through marriage, not conquest. Part 4. The Seeds of Madness. Aegon built his throne from the swords of his defeated enemies, 1,000 blades, melted and fused by dragonfire and shaped into the Iron Throne. It was deliberately uncomfortable. Aegon believed a king should never sit easy. The throne cut him sometimes, badly, and every Targaryen after him bled on it in one way or another. The dynasty that followed the conquest was, in its early generations, largely successful. Aegon's sons, Aenys and Maegor, followed him, and here is where things get dark early. Aenys was Aegon's first son and heir. He was gentle, indecisive, and poorly suited for ruling in the violent climate left by the conquest. His reign was marked by religious uprisings from the faith of the Seven, who objected violently to Targaryen incest and polygamy. Aenys could not suppress them effectively and died after just 5 years on the throne, likely of stress-related illness made worse by grief and conflict. Then came Maegor. Maegor the Cruel is in the running of awful Targaryen kings, a genuinely strong contender for the worst, and that's a competitive field. He was Aegon's son by his other wife, Visenya, and he was everything Aenys was not: brutal, decisive, physically enormous, and completely willing to do whatever was necessary to hold power. He crushed the Faith militant uprising with extraordinary violence. He outlawed the Faith's military orders. He burned the warriors' sons and poor fellows in such numbers that the religious war effectively ended because there was no one left to fight it. But Maegor's personal life was a slow catastrophe. He was desperate for an heir and took 6 wives trying to produce one. None of his children survived. Some were born dead and described in ways that made the maesters deeply uncomfortable. His wives died. His enemies multiplied. Toward the end of his reign, men started defecting to his nephew Jaehaerys, who had a strong claim and, crucially, hadn't spent years making everyone around him terrified. Maegor was found dead on the Iron Throne. The blades had cut into him deeply. Whether he took his own life, was murdered, or simply collapsed, the throne itself, in a story sense, seemed to reject him. No one was ever charged. No one confessed. It's one of the great unsolved moments in Targaryen history. Part 5. The Conciliator and the Question of Succession. Jaehaerys I, the Conciliator, the Old King, is, by most measures, the greatest Targaryen king who ever ruled. He reigned for 55 years. He built the King's Road. He reached a peace with the Faith that would hold for generations. He worked with his queen, Alicent, to expand rights and protections across the realm. He was patient, intelligent, politically gifted, and loved by his people in a way that most monarchs only dream of. And even he couldn't escape the Targaryen curse, which was not always madness. It was sometimes simply grief. Jaehaerys and Alicent had 13 children. 9 of them died before either parent. They watched their heirs fall one by one, to illness, to accident, to war. The king who had built so much outlived nearly everyone he loved, and by the end of his reign, he was a fragile, diminished version of himself, barely able to function. The question of who would succeed him planted the seed of everything that followed. Because Jaehaerys had no obvious direct heir by the end of his reign, a great council was called in 101 AC, the largest gathering of lords in the history of Westeros up to that point. Around 1,000 lords came to Harrenhal to vote on the succession. There were 2 main claimants: Laenor Velaryon, whose claim came through his mother, Jaehaerys' eldest daughter, and Viserys, whose claim came through his father, Jaehaerys' eldest surviving son. The council chose Viserys, and in doing so, they established a principle: the male line claim takes precedence over the female line claim. A grandson through a son beats a grandson through a daughter. That decision seems technical and administrative, but it was a loaded weapon, and within a generation, it went off. Part 6. The Dance of the Dragons. Viserys I was a good-natured, well-liked king who made one catastrophic mistake. Actually, he made several, but they all stem from the same source. He could not make a decision and hold to it under pressure. His first wife, Aemma Arryn, died in childbirth along with the son she was delivering, a horrific scene depicted in detail in House of the Dragon. He had one surviving child from her, a daughter named Rhaenyra. He named Rhaenyra his heir. He made his lord swear to support her. He publicly declared her the Princess of Dragonstone. This was extraordinary. A woman named as the direct heir of the Iron Throne, and it carried enormous weight. Then he married again. His new wife was Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his hand, and Alicent gave him sons. The court fractured along what became known as the Green and Black factions, Greens supporting Queen Alicent and her children, Blacks supporting Rhaenyra and her claim. Viserys refused to clearly adjudicate between them. He maintained to his death that Rhaenyra was his heir. He never wavered on that publicly, but he also never managed the increasingly hostile rivalry between his daughter and his wife, and when he died in 129 AC, what his silence had created exploded into a civil war. The small council, dominated by Alicent's father, Sir Otto Hightower, crowned Alicent's son, Aegon II, before Rhaenyra even knew her father was dead. Rhaenyra's supporters rallied to her. Both sides had dragons, both sides had armies, the dance of the dragons. That's what they called the civil war that followed. And it is, within the world of the story, the defining catastrophe of the Targaryen dynasty. Not because of how many people died, though the numbers were staggering, but because of what they lost: dragons. At the start of the war, the Targaryens had 17 dragons between the two sides. By the end, there were 4. In less than 3 years, 13 dragons were killed, in battle, through treachery, in the chaos of a city uprising. The most powerful weapons and symbols of Targaryen rule were gutted in a family dispute. The specifics of how some of them died are worth noting. Vhagar, the last surviving dragon from the Conquest, the oldest and largest dragon alive, was killed in a fight with a younger dragon, Caraxes, ridden by Rhaenyra's son, Daemon Targaryen. Both dragons fell into the God's Eye Lake. Daemon and Vhagar's rider, Aemond, both died in the fall. It was the largest dragon battle in the history of the story, and it effectively ended both of their stories simultaneously. The city of King's Landing saw its own horror during the dance. A mob, whipped into fury by 2 men called the Shepherd and the Cheese, broke into the dragon pit and attacked the dragons kept there. 4 of them, armed with torches and spears in sheer numbers. The dragons killed hundreds, maybe thousands, but they died too, one by one, overwhelmed. People in the city watched the dragon pit burn. The sound of dying dragons could be heard across King's Landing. Rhaenyra took King's Landing briefly and was declared queen, but her position was precarious and her support was eroding. When Aegon II caught her, after she had been betrayed by allies, he had her killed, fed to his dragon Sunfire in front of her son. Aegon II won the throne, and then died of poison 6 months later, leaving no clear path forward and a realm in ruins. Rhaenyra's son, Aegon III, eventually took the throne. He had watched his mother die. He had seen the dragon pit burn. He hated dragons for the rest of his life, and under his rule, the last Targaryen dragons quietly died out, one by one, until there were none. The dragons were gone, and they didn't come back for 150 years when Daenerys Targaryen hatched 3 eggs in a pyre on the Dothraki Sea. Part 7. The Century of Broken Kings. After the dance, the Targaryen dynasty went through what historians in the story don't quite call a decline, but that's what it was. Aegon III, called the Dragonbane, ruled for years in deep depression and barely concealed trauma. His sons followed him, and neither was particularly distinguished. Daeron I, the young dragon, conquered Dorne at the age of 14, and then lost it, and lost his life almost immediately. He led an army of 10,000 men into Dorne, and fewer than 3,000 came back. He was killed at a peace talk, an ambush. He was 18. Baelor I, the Blessed, the Pious, was probably the strangest Targaryen king to sit the throne without being considered outright mad. He was a Septon king, a genuinely devout man who walked barefoot to Dorne to negotiate peace, who once walked through a pit of vipers and was bitten and survived. He was beloved by the common people and the faith. He also locked his own sisters in a tower called the Maiden Vault because he felt their presence tempted him. He fasted so severely and so often that his health collapsed and he died at a relatively young age, having never consummated his marriage, having left no heirs. His uncle, the very same man he had locked away, took the throne. These kings were not Aegon the Conqueror, they were not Jaehaerys, but the dynasty held even without dragons because the system Aegon had built was resilient enough to survive mediocre kings for a while. Part 8. The Mad King. Skip forward to the reign of Aerys II, and you reach the moment that directly produces everything in Game of Thrones. Aerys started well enough. He was charming, ambitious, had grand ideas for the kingdom. His relationship with his hand, Tywin Lannister, was extraordinarily productive in the early years. Tywin was one of the most competent administrators in the history of the realm, and he and Aerys together made the early reign a success. But Aerys was always a little unstable. And over the years, a series of events, a kidnapping at Duskendale where he was held captive for half a year, repeated failed pregnancies between him and his sister wife Rhaella, growing paranoia about Tywin's power and popularity, peeled away whatever stability he had. His madness was not a sudden break, it was a slow erosion. He began to trust no one. He began to see plots everywhere. He developed a fascination with fire, with wildfire specifically, the magical explosive substance produced by the Alchemists Guild. He began having people burned, not in wars, not in battles, in the throne room. Lords, knights, anyone he decided on a whim was a traitor. His catchphrase whispered about him in fear was, "Burn them all." When Lyanna Stark was allegedly taken by Prince Rhaegar, her brother Brandon came to King's Landing to demand justice. Aerys had Brandon arrested for treason. When Brandon's father, Lord Rickard Stark, came to court to plead for his son's life, Aerys had him tried by combat, with fire as his champion. Rickard Stark was hung in his armor over a fire, slowly roasting. Brandon Stark was placed in a strangulation device and told he could save his father if he could reach a sword, which he couldn't, because the device tightened when he struggled. Father and son died in front of the court, and then Aerys demanded the heads of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon from their respective guardians. Jon Arryn refused, and the rebellion began. Robert's rebellion ended at the Battle of the Trident, where Robert Baratheon killed Prince Rhaegar in single combat in the river. It ended at King's Landing, where Tywin Lannister, who had waited until he was sure of the outcome, arrived with his army and sacked the city. Aerys, in his final moments, ordered his pyromancer to detonate the wildfire caches he had hidden throughout the city, enough wildfire to burn King's Landing to ash and everyone in it. Jaime Lannister, a knight of the King's Guard sworn to protect the king, killed the pyromancer and then drove his sword through Aerys' back. He sat on the Iron Throne, the throne Aegon had built, waiting. When Eddard Stark arrived, Jaime was sitting on it, gold armor smeared with blood, not taking it, just waiting. Aerys' youngest children, Viserys and the newborn Daenerys, were smuggled out of the city and across the narrow sea by loyalists. The dynasty was over in Westeros, and the world that Game of Thrones begins in was the world left behind. Part 9. The Exile. What happened to the Targaryen children on the other side of the narrow sea is its own story, and not a gentle one. Viserys and Daenerys grew up in poverty and exile, moving from city to city, dependent on the charity of people who had once been loyal to their father and were now just trying to be polite. Viserys became increasingly unstable under the pressure. He was obsessed with reclaiming the throne, but he had nothing. No army, no money, no dragons, no real allies. He sold his sister into marriage to a Dothraki warlord in exchange for an army he believed he would be given. He treated Daenerys as a commodity her entire childhood, calling himself her protector while reminding her constantly that she existed only to serve his ambitions. The thing he called love was possession. The crown he was certain was coming was never coming. When Drogo finally had enough of Viserys, after Viserys threatened Daenerys and her unborn child in the middle of a Dothraki camp, he gave him what Viserys had always called his birthright, a golden crown. Molten gold poured over his head. Daenerys watched and felt nothing, and said so. He was not the last dragon, as he had always believed. She was. Part 10. Rhaegar, the prince who was promised. There is one Targaryen who never appeared in Game of Thrones until a brief vision and a flashback, who, nonetheless, shaped everything in the story more than almost anyone else. Rhaegar Targaryen, Aerys' eldest son, was by all accounts brilliant. A scholar, a musician, a warrior who became dedicated to combat relatively late. He picked up a sword after reading something in an ancient book that convinced him he had to be a fighter. He was obsessed with a prophecy, the prince who was promised, a messianic figure from ancient Valyrian legend who would be born of the dragon's blood and be the hero who faces a great darkness. He believed it was him. He anointed himself at a tournament at Harrenhal in a strange, wordless ceremony that confused everyone watching. He believed his child would be the one, and when his wife, Elia Martell, could not safely bear a third child, nearly dying in the births of her first two, Rhaegar became convinced he needed another woman to produce the prophecy's child. He crowned Lyanna Stark, the Queen of Love and Beauty, at the tournament, over his own wife's head, in front of the entire realm. And then, later, he either took Lyanna or she went with him, depending on who you believe in the story, to the Tower of Joy in Dorne. He left his wife, he left his children, he left the realm on the verge of eruption, and then he died at the Trident before he could explain himself to anyone. The secret that Jon Snow discovers, that his real name is Aegon Targaryen, that his parents were Rhaegar and Lyanna, who were privately married, is the revelation Rhaegar's entire gamble was aimed at, a child of ice and fire, of Stark and Targaryen, the legitimate heir to everything. Whether that child was the prince who was promised, neither the books nor the show fully commits to. But the prophecy that started with Daenerys, the dreamer, the family's belief that they were chosen, that they could see the shape of the future, runs all the way from before the doom of Valyria to the shores of Westeros, and it echoes in every decision Rhaegar ever made. Part 11. The Last Dragons. Daenerys Targaryen hatched 3 dragons in the pyre that cremated Khal Drogo in a night that the people around her could not fully explain. Fire that should have killed her did not. Eggs that had been stoned for 150 years hatched, and for the first time since the last dragon had died under Aegon III, there were dragons in the world. She named them Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, after Drogo, Rhaegar, and Viserys, respectively, and over the following years, she did something no Targaryen had done in generations. She built a military and political force from nothing. She took the Unsullied in Astapor by turning their own purchase against their sellers. She liberated slaves across 3 of the great cities of Essos. She built a coalition of freed peoples, sellswords, Dothraki, and, eventually, Westerosi allies. She crossed the Narrow Sea, and then came the Long Night, the threat that Daenerys had maybe seen in her dream all those centuries ago, the great darkness that Rhaegar had maybe been trying to build a hero to face, the Night King, the dead, the war that had nothing to do with thrones. They won. The dead were defeated. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, killed the Night King, or Arya Stark did, depending on how you count it, but they survived. And then, the morning after the war that should have ended everything else, Daenerys looked south towards King's Landing and the Iron Throne that had been her family's seat for nearly 300 years, and something in her broke, or was already broken. Whether it was the isolation, the betrayal, the grief of losing her closest friend and an advisor she trusted, or something in her blood, the Targaryen coin that always lands on greatness or madness, what she did at King's Landing became the defining act of her story. The city bells rang. The surrender had begun, and she kept burning. The bells that were supposed to signal her victory became the sound that ended her claim to anything other than fear. Jon Snow killed her in the throne room. The last Targaryen, or the last one anyone knew of, died at the hands of the man who was also a Targaryen, in the room their ancestors had built, underneath a ceiling that had just collapsed. Drogon melted the Iron Throne. Not Jon, not Bran, not any human hand. The dragon. It's one of the most loaded images in the entire series. The throne that Aegon built from his enemies' swords, that Maegor died on, that Jaehaerys ruled from wisely, that Aerys descended into madness on, gone, melted down by the last dragon carrying the last queen out of the story. 300 years. That's how long the Targaryens sat on the Iron Throne, from Aegon's Landing to Robert's Rebellion. Add the century of exile before that, and the centuries in Dragonstone before that, and the history in Valyria before that, and you have one of the most unbroken chains of consequence in any fantasy world ever written. What's remarkable is how consistent the themes are. Prophecy, fire, the belief in being chosen, the danger of too much certainty, the fragility of power that depends on dragons rather than on people, the way that what made them extraordinary, the bloodline, the incest-driven concentration of power and madness, the bond with dragons, was also what kept destroying them from within. The Targaryens built the world of Game of Thrones. Every noble house, every political structure, every alliance and rivalry in Westeros was shaped by the fact that 3 people landed with 3 dragons and refused to be told no. And then they burned it several times. That's the history of the Dragon Dynasty. And somehow, knowing all of it makes every scene in both shows hit a little differently.